This image was taken from a split-second frame in the corrupted bootleg version in the SpongeBob episode Dumped. Other than the image, the rest of the video is composed of incomprehensible jumbles of colors, static, or just black screens. The audio seems to be a heavily distorted version of the audio from the original episode, with loud droning buzzes occasionally interrupting it. The bootleg tape itself was found in December 2004 by a group of 5 teenagers from the city rummaging around in a trash can within an abandoned mental institution. Of these 5 individuals, 2 have committed suicide, 1 has gone missing, 1 refuses to comment on the tape, and the last hastily agreed to give paranormal investigators the tape shortly after being interviewed about the suicide and disappearances of the 3 other persons. The current whereabouts of the tape are unknown, and many who stare at this image for a long enough period of time claim to see SpongeBob blink.
Determine if you qualify for financial assistance.
When I was growing up, my dad and I lived with my grandparents. My parents had me while they were teenagers, and my dad got full custody because he lived with my grandparents, and my mom was just living with random friends, going from house to house every few weeks. I was the daughter my grandparents never had, and they doted on me. When I was 6, my grandpa passed away from cancer. This story takes place about 5 months after he passed. This was, I believe, on a Saturday, and my dad was at work. My gram decided to take me to McDonald's for lunch, and like any 6-year-old, I was really excited. So we go down to the McDonald's that was about 1.5 miles from our house, order our lunch, and sit down at a table to eat. At the time, we were the only ones eating inside. About 10 minutes after we sit down, though, a scraggly-looking man walks in, orders a meal, and sits down at the table diagonally in front of us to the left. The area we lived in was middle and upper class, so this guy looked pretty out of place. Graham had her back to him, but I could see him perfectly. This man was in at least his mid-50s, with really wiry, scraggy, and dirty white hair and a beard. He had on blue shorts and a white t-shirt, also kind of dirty, and sandals. It's amazing. This happened 21 years ago, but I can remember it like it was yesterday. So I noticed that under the table, this man had something dark, pink, and wrinkly in his lap, and he kept glancing at me and rubbing it every few seconds. In kindergarten, we learned about stranger danger and good touch, bad touch, and learned which parts of our body people weren't supposed to touch. It clicked in my 6-year-old head that this man was not supposed to have that out like that, nor be doing what he was doing. I got really queasy and nervous. I didn't want to tell my gram right then and there, because I thought the man might hurt us. If my dad had been there, though, I would have said something, because my dad was my hero and could take on anybody. Instead, I put my Happy Meal box in front of my face, so my view of this guy could be blocked. I had about half of my food left, but at this point I'd lost my appetite. Graham asked me if I was full, and I just nodded yes. I was, and still am, very petite, so not finishing a full meal was nothing new for me. She asked me if I wanted to go play in the play area before we left, but I just shook my head and quietly said, I want to go home. Graham cleared our table, and we left. When we got home, I was still really nervous, and I felt like I was going to throw up. Graham asked me, "What's the matter, Munchkin?" her pet name for me, and I started crying and told her about the man at the McDonald's and what I saw. My Gram didn't panic or freak or get hysterical. She just hugged me and said, "It's all right. Go on to your room and play. I'll take care of it." She wiped my tears, gave me a blueberry Kool-Aid burst, and told our dog, Patches, wishes to go to my room with me, which she did. After I was out of earshot, Graham called the McDonald's and told them about this guy. Turns out he was still there. The manager told Graham he'd take care of it and call her back. An hour later, the manager calls back and tells Graham they called the police, who showed up in record time and arrested the guy. When the police told the man to stand up, his franken beans were still hanging out of his shorts. The manager also told Graham that she could bring me back for a month's worth of coupons for free Happy Meals. I have another story about a weirdo that happened a few years later, and this time my dad was there. And believe me, what my dad did to him was not pretty. But that's a story for another time. I was living in a low-income housing apartment in Minnesota, and at the time, my mom and I simply couldn't afford to have an actual internet provider. This meant that I leached off of people in my building who had an unprotected wireless connection. Whenever their internet connections would go out, I would be forced to walk down to McDonald's in order to use the free Wi-Fi there. This had become a pretty common thing for me. During one of these internet droughts, I was standing about in the lobby of my apartment, about to leave, when the guy who lived next door to me, an older guy named Joe, stops me before I go. He tells me that him and another one of my neighbors were going to McDonald's for coffee, and that he'd buy me one if I went along. I figured, why not? I didn't really know much about Joe, since I mostly kept to myself. Let me explain Joe. He's a hunchback with a beard gut, and his ZZ Top-esque beard was full of food crumbs that I can only assume were from a McBiscuit. But he seemed like a nice enough guy, so I went along. After a ride in his rickety truck through the Minnesota winter, I was happy to reach the McDonald's. Free Wi-Fi at last. And if Joe held up to his word, a free McCoffee as well. I sit down and fire up the laptop to soak in all of that free Wi-Fi. Soon after, Joe comes back with our McCoffees. As soon as he sits down, he starts asking me in a raspy voice, "So, boy, ever heard of God's DNA?" I look up from the Windows loading screen and ask, what? I was totally baffled and thinking, great, stuck with another fucking missionary. He goes on to inform me that God's DNA is the molecules that hold the universe together. Not to mention, it's what makes men genetically superior to women. I sure as shit didn't learn that in physics class, so I blew him off, and when I got the chance, quietly ducked into another booth to browse the internet in peace. He didn't seem to notice, because afterwards, a barrage of freaky beardy lumberjack dudes would come in and out of the McDonald's and talk to him for like 15 minutes at a time. I can only assume they were talking about God's DNA, because I did my best not to pay any attention. But Joe and his gang of weirdos still gave me a very creeped out feeling. I could tell that they kept looking over to stare at me when they thought I wasn't looking. Having had enough weirdness for the night, I decided to duck out when he hobbled off to the bathroom, I assume only to take an epic mix shit. I took my chance, folded up the laptop, and headed out to brave the cold Minnesota winter on the way back home. I reckon that having to put up with the elements was still preferable to being around a bunch of weird-looking lumberjack creeps. I was almost back to the apartment when I heard the truck slowly rolling up and crunching the snow. I looked over my shoulder and saw Joe in his truck. Next to him was another one of those fucking bearded bums from McDonald's. I waved to them, but I got no response. Whatever, I thought. I went home for the night after that creepiness. But then, every night after that, every time I went to McDonald's, either Joe or one of his weirdo lumberjack buddies would be there. I could practically feel them leering at me. They always appeared grungy and disheveled. Forced to go to McDonald's just to use the internet, I tried avoiding them as much as I could. It almost seemed as if they knew ahead of time that I was going to be there. Considering they all had a relationship with Joe, I think it's very much likely that they actually did. Eventually, someone broke into Joe's apartment and stole his bicycle, prompting him to move elsewhere. I learned a couple of things about Joe after he left the apartment, such as that he traded most of his food stamps every month for drugs, and that he regularly told women in our apartment that he wanted to leave his body and spirit and ravish them in their sleep, whatever that meant. After this point, though, I saw the McDonald's stalkers only sparingly, and then finally, never again.